Sometimes the safest place inside a prison is the one everyone else fears the most, and by the end of this story, an entire cell block would discover why they should have asked one simple question before choosing their next victim. The afternoon recreation period at Ironwood State Prison usually followed the same predictable rhythm. Inmates walked slow circles around the yard, some gathered around metal picnic tables trading stories, while others lifted weights beneath the watchful eyes of correctional officers standing along the perimeter. Beyond the chain-link fencing, tucked behind another secured gate, stood the K-9 training enclosure. Most inmates avoided even looking in that direction for very long. The sound of disciplined barking carried across the yard every afternoon, reminding everyone that the prison dogs were trained with extraordinary precision and handled only by authorized staff. For years, the K-9 area had become part of the prison's mythology. New inmates heard stories within hours of arriving. Stay away from the fence. Do not attract the dog's attention. Never give the officers a reason to bring the handlers outside the enclosure. Whether the stories were exaggerated hardly mattered. Fear had already done its job. Marcus Reed stepped into that yard for the very first time wearing a freshly issued prison uniform, carrying nothing except a folded blanket beneath one arm and a calm expression that never searched for approval. At 38 years old, the quiet black inmate walked with measured confidence, observing every building, every security camera, every locked gate, and every face without staring at anyone directly. He looked less like a frightened newcomer and more like a man carefully learning the rules of an unfamiliar workplace. That alone caught people's attention. Most new arrivals revealed their emotions immediately. Marcus revealed almost nothing. From across the yard, Tyler Briggs noticed him within minutes. The 35-year-old white inmate had spent years building a reputation as the unofficial authority inside his housing unit. He enjoyed testing every newcomer because first impressions often determined the invisible hierarchy that shaped prison life. Surrounded by 3 loyal followers, Tyler leaned against a concrete pillar and smiled. "Fresh transfer," one inmate muttered. Tyler nodded slowly, without taking his eyes off Marcus. "He is walking like he thinks he belongs here." Another inmate laughed quietly. "Give him an hour." Tyler pushed himself away from the wall and started toward Marcus with relaxed confidence. Conversations nearby gradually faded as experienced inmates recognized the familiar pattern. Whenever Tyler approached someone new, people naturally stopped to watch. Marcus continued walking until Tyler casually stepped into his path. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Tyler studied the quiet newcomer, expecting nervousness, excuses, or forced confidence. Instead, Marcus simply waited with patient composure. "First day?" Tyler finally asked with an easy grin. Marcus nodded once. "That is right." Tyler folded his arms. "Then let me give you some friendly advice. Around here, respect is earned fast or it disappears even faster." Marcus looked briefly across the yard toward the distant K-9 enclosure before answering. Respect that has to be demanded usually does not last very long. A few nearby inmates exchanged surprised glances. Marcus had not sounded defiant. His voice remained calm, almost thoughtful, yet his answer somehow unsettled the atmosphere. Tyler smiled wider, convinced he had found someone interesting. "You like giving speeches?" Marcus gently shook his head. "I prefer listening." Tyler chuckled and looked toward his followers. "Good. Then listen carefully. Before this day ends, everyone here is going to remember your name." The men around him laughed, believing another public humiliation was already beginning. Marcus remained completely still. Then, from somewhere beyond the secured fence, a deep K-9 bark echoed across the recreation yard. Unlike everyone else, Marcus instinctively turned his head toward the sound. His expression softened for only a fraction of a second before returning to complete composure. Tyler noticed that tiny reaction immediately. He followed Marcus's gaze toward the enclosure, and a slow smile spread across his face. An idea had just entered his mind, and everyone standing nearby mistakenly believed they already knew exactly how this story would end. The deep bark echoed across the recreation yard once more, lingering in the afternoon air long after every other sound had faded. Most inmates instinctively glanced away from the K-9 enclosure, but Marcus Reed continued looking toward the secured training area for another brief moment before calmly returning his attention to the yard around him. The movement was so subtle that almost nobody noticed it. Almost nobody except Tyler Briggs. Years of controlling conversations and reading people's reactions had taught Tyler to recognize hesitation, curiosity, and fear. What he had just seen on Marcus's face looked different. It was neither anxiety nor fascination. It looked strangely familiar, almost like recognition. Tyler narrowed his eyes for a second before his confident smile returned. "You interested in the dogs?" he asked casually. Marcus answered with the same calm voice that never seemed to rise above ordinary conversation. "They are impressive animals." Tyler laughed softly. Impressive is one word for them. Dangerous is another. Several inmates standing nearby nodded in agreement. Stories about the prison dogs had grown larger with every passing year, and many newcomers believed every rumor they heard. Marcus simply replied, "Animals usually respond to how people treat them." One of Tyler's followers laughed loudly. "Listen to this guy. He talks like he knows them." Marcus did not answer. Instead, he quietly stepped aside as another group of inmates crossed the yard carrying basketballs toward the recreation court. Tyler watched the newcomer carefully. Silence usually frustrated people. Somehow Marcus made silence look comfortable. That irritated Tyler more than open defiance ever could. As the afternoon continued, Marcus walked through different sections of the recreation yard without drawing attention to himself. He stopped beside a drinking fountain, thanked another inmate who held the gate open, and quietly helped an older prisoner retrieve a dropped book before continuing on his way. Every action seemed natural, unhurried, and completely free of the nervous energy most newcomers carried on their first day. Several inmates began noticing the same thing. "He is different," one whispered. "Too calm," another answered. Across the yard, Tyler leaned against the fence while watching Marcus from a distance. One of his friends walked beside him and lowered his voice. "What are you thinking?" Tyler smiled without looking away. "Everybody has something they care about. We just found his." His friend glanced toward the K9 enclosure and slowly grinned. "The dogs?" Tyler nodded. "Did you see his face when they barked?" "Maybe he was scared." Tyler shook his head. "No, that was not fear. That was something else." At that very moment, another bark echoed from behind the secured fencing. Marcus instinctively turned again, although this time he smiled almost imperceptibly before continuing his walk. The expression lasted barely a second, but Tyler saw enough. His curiosity transformed into opportunity. Nearby, Correctional Officer Linda Alvarez stood watching the recreation yard from the security gate leading toward the K9 training area. She had worked with the prison K9 unit for nearly 12 years and knew every handler assigned to Ironwood. As Marcus briefly looked toward the enclosure, she noticed something unusual. Instead of staring directly at the dogs, he observed the handlers themselves, quietly following their movements with the attention of someone studying familiar routines rather than unfamiliar procedures. Alvarez frowned thoughtfully before checking the afternoon schedule clipped to her clipboard. Marcus read, "New transfer." Nothing immediately stood out in the paperwork she had received earlier that day. Still, something about the man's calm reaction remained in the back of her mind. Meanwhile, Tyler slowly gathered 3 of his closest followers near the basketball court, speaking quietly enough that only they could hear. They listened carefully before smiling one after another. Whatever Tyler had planned, they clearly found the idea entertaining. As they separated and disappeared into different corners of the yard, Marcus remained completely unaware of the conversations unfolding around him. He simply paused beside the chain-link fence, closed his eyes for a brief breath of fresh air, and listened as another distant bark drifted across Ironwood State Prison, sounding less like a warning to him and more like the echo of a life he had once known. The afternoon sun settled lower over Ironwood State Prison, stretching long shadows across the cracked concrete of the recreation yard. What had begun as an ordinary first day for Marcus Reed slowly transformed into something else entirely. Everywhere he walked, quiet conversations seemed to pause for a second before continuing again after he passed. New inmates usually attracted attention because they looked uncertain. Marcus attracted attention because he did not. His steady pace never changed, his shoulders remained relaxed, and his eyes calmly observed every corner of the facility without appearing nervous or suspicious. It was the behavior of someone who believed understanding a place was more valuable than reacting to it. Beyond the inner security fence, the K9 training area followed its own disciplined routine. Two correctional officers guided several German shepherds through obedience exercises while another officer recorded notes on a clipboard. Sharp commands echoed through the afternoon air, followed immediately by precise responses from the dogs. Most inmates ignored the sounds completely. Marcus did not. Each familiar command caused his attention to drift toward the enclosure for only a brief moment before returning to whatever he had been doing. There was no excitement in his expression, only quiet recognition, as though distant memories had suddenly become part of the present once again. Officer Linda Alvarez noticed it for the third time that afternoon. Standing beside the secured entrance leading toward the canine facility, she watched Marcus from across the yard with growing curiosity. Every experienced dog handler recognized another handler by habits that ordinary people rarely noticed. Marcus never stared directly into a dog's eyes from a distance. He instinctively observed posture before movement. When one German shepherd completed a difficult exercise, Marcus almost smiled before quietly lowering his eyes again. Those tiny details refused to leave Alvarez's thoughts. Nearby, Tyler Briggs continued watching from the wait area with 3 loyal followers gathered around him. One of them folded his arms and asked, "You still thinking about the dog yard?" Tyler nodded slowly. "The whole prison avoids that fence. He keeps looking at it." Another inmate shrugged. "Maybe he is just curious." Tyler smiled without humor. Curiosity gives people away. Whatever matters most to them eventually becomes their weakness. His friends laughed softly, already anticipating another public spectacle. Tyler glanced across the yard toward the secured gate protecting the K9 enclosure. Tomorrow, everyone will be watching. Meanwhile, Marcus walked toward a quiet corner of the yard where an elderly inmate struggled to organize several legal documents scattered by a sudden breeze. Without hesitation, Marcus bent down, gathered each page carefully, arranged them in order, and handed the folder back with a respectful nod. "Thank you," the older man said warmly. Marcus answered with a gentle smile. Everyone needs a hand sometimes. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet several nearby inmates noticed it. Some looked puzzled. Others simply watched in silence. Acts of simple kindness had become rare enough inside Ironwood that they often attracted as much attention as open conflict. As the afternoon recreation period neared its end, another deep bark rolled across the prison yard. This time it was followed by a second, lower bark that carried an unmistakable rhythm. Marcus stopped walking for only a heartbeat. His breathing slowed almost imperceptibly before a quiet expression of recognition crossed his face. Without speaking aloud, he softly whispered 2 words beneath his breath. "Good boy." No one standing nearby heard him clearly, but Officer Alvarez saw his lips move. Her curiosity deepened immediately. That was not the reaction of someone intimidated by a working dog. It was the reaction of someone greeting an old friend. Before she could think further, the closing whistle signaled the end of recreation. Inmates slowly formed orderly lines toward their housing units while Tyler remained standing near the fence, watching Marcus disappear into the crowd. A satisfied smile spread across his face because, in his mind, tomorrow's humiliation was already planned. He believed he had found exactly where the quiet newcomer was most vulnerable. What Tyler never considered was that sometimes the place people fear the most is also the place where another person feels completely at home. The evening passed quietly inside Ironwood State Prison, but quiet did not mean peaceful. By the time the final count ended and the housing units settled into their nightly routine, conversations about the new inmate had already spread through nearly every tier. Some inmates described Marcus Reed as fearless. Others insisted he was simply too inexperienced to understand where he had been transferred. A few believed his calm attitude was only an act that would disappear within days. Marcus paid no attention to any of it. Inside his small cell, he folded his blanket with careful precision, organized the few personal items he had been issued, and spent several minutes sitting silently beneath the narrow window where only a strip of fading evening sky could be seen through layers of steel fencing. His cellmate, an older inmate named Walter Jenkins, watched him with quiet curiosity. "Most men do not sleep much on their first night," Walter said. Marcus smiled politely. "Tomorrow arrives whether we worry about it or not." Walter leaned back against the concrete wall. "You seem different from the others." Marcus looked toward the window again before answering. "Everyone carries experiences that other people cannot see." Walter nodded slowly. sensing there was far more behind those words than Marcus intended to explain. Across another section of the housing unit, Tyler Briggs gathered 3 trusted followers near the dayroom television while the rest of the inmates prepared for lights out. Their conversation remained low enough that correctional officers passing through the corridor heard nothing unusual. Tyler rested his elbows on the table and spoke with complete confidence. "Tomorrow afternoon we are going to give our new friend a memory he will never forget." One of the younger inmates grinned. "The dog yard." Tyler nodded. "He keeps looking at it like it means something." Another follower chuckled. "Once he gets close enough, he will never do that again." Tyler smiled, convinced the idea would strengthen his reputation even further. "Everybody in this place avoids that enclosure. Tomorrow the whole yard will see why." None of them realized that Officer Linda Alvarez was finishing paperwork only a few rooms away. Earlier that evening, she had quietly reviewed the transfer information attached to Marcus Reed's intake file. The paperwork listed basic identification, previous correctional facilities, and medical information, but almost everything about his employment history before incarceration had been heavily summarized. One short sentence near the bottom caught her attention. "Prior service involving specialized canine operations." The wording was unusually vague. Alvarez frowned thoughtfully. Correctional paperwork rarely described experience in such broad language unless details had been omitted during transfer. She closed the file without drawing conclusions, yet the phrase continued echoing through her thoughts. The following morning began with the familiar sounds of steel doors unlocking and inmates preparing for another carefully scheduled day. Long before breakfast, Marcus quietly stepped into the recreation yard during the early movement period. The rising sun painted soft golden light across the concrete, while the prison remained unusually peaceful. Without attracting attention, Marcus stood near the far fence where he could hear distant movement from the K-9 training area, beginning another day. He never crossed the restricted boundary or attempted to approach the enclosure. Instead, he simply listened. A low bark echoed across the yard, followed by another shorter command from one of the handlers. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, almost as though recognizing an old melody. Officer Alvarez happened to be inspecting the security gate nearby. She watched Marcus for several silent seconds before speaking. "You seem familiar with working dogs." Marcus opened his eyes and offered a respectful smile. "They teach patience better than most people do." Alvarez studied him carefully. "That is an interesting answer." Marcus nodded once. Usually the simplest answers are the most honest. Before she could ask another question, the morning announcement echoed across the prison, signaling breakfast movement. Marcus thanked her with a polite nod and walked toward the dining hall without another word. Alvarez remained standing beside the gate, watching him disappear into the crowd, while a growing feeling told her the quiet newcomer was carrying a story far bigger than anyone inside Ironwood had yet begun to understand. By the time the afternoon recreation period returned, anticipation had quietly replaced ordinary routine across Ironwood State Prison. Small groups of inmates drifted toward the open yard earlier than usual, pretending to stretch, walk laps, or shoot basketballs while their attention remained fixed on one person. Tyler Briggs had made certain enough people heard his jokes that morning to guarantee an audience. Nobody knew exactly what he intended to do, but everyone sensed another public test was coming. Marcus Reed stepped into the recreation yard carrying the same calm expression he had worn since arriving at Ironwood. He acknowledged an elderly inmate with a polite nod, returned a borrowed book to the small recreation shelf near the wall, and paused for a moment beneath the afternoon sunlight before continuing his slow walk around the perimeter. Nothing about his behavior suggested he expected trouble. That frustrated Tyler more than he admitted. Standing beside the basketball court, Tyler watched Marcus with narrowed eyes while speaking quietly to the 3 inmates who had agreed to help him. "Remember," he said, "do not rush it. Let everybody gather first." One of the men glanced toward the secured K-9 enclosure. "You really think you will go near that place?" Tyler smiled confidently. He has looked at those dogs since the minute he arrived. Curiosity always wins. Across the yard, Officer Linda Alvarez stood beside the security gate leading toward the K-9 training area, reviewing equipment with another correctional officer assigned to the K-9 unit. Inside the enclosure, several German Shepherds completed afternoon obedience drills under the supervision of experienced handlers. Every command was delivered calmly. Every response came with remarkable discipline. Marcus briefly watched from a respectful distance before quietly turning away, never attempting to approach the restricted area. Alvarez noticed that detail immediately. Most curious inmates lingered near the fence. Marcus deliberately kept his distance, almost as though he understood professional boundaries better than anyone expected. Her curiosity continued growing. During a short break between training exercises, she quietly entered the administrative office connected to the K-9 facility and reopened the transfer file she had reviewed the previous evening. The summary remained frustratingly brief, but this time she noticed an attached reference number connected to Marcus's previous employment records. She entered the number into the internal corrections database. Seconds later, an archive training certification appeared on her screen. Her eyes widened. The record identified Marcus Reed as a certified K-9 handler and trainer with years of experience working alongside specialized law enforcement K-9 teams before his incarceration. The certification listed advanced tracking, obedience development, and handler instruction. Alvarez slowly leaned back in her chair, absorbing what she had just discovered. "That explains everything," she whispered. Before she could continue reading, a radio call interrupted her, requesting additional staff near the recreation yard for routine supervision. She quickly closed the file, intending to return after her shift. Outside, Tyler casually approached Marcus with the relaxed confidence of someone convinced the entire afternoon belonged to him. "You settling in?" he asked with an exaggerated smile. Marcus answered politely, "I am learning." Tyler chuckled. "Good. Then maybe it is time you learned one more thing." Marcus remained silent, patiently waiting. Tyler pointed toward the distant K-9 enclosure. "Everybody here has to face their fears eventually." Marcus followed Tyler's gesture with a brief glance before calmly replying, "Fear usually tells us more about ourselves than the place we are standing." Tyler laughed loudly enough for nearby inmates to hear. Several conversations stopped as people instinctively turned toward them. Exactly as Tyler had hoped, a crowd slowly began forming. He looked around at the growing audience and smiled with complete satisfaction. In his mind, every piece of his plan had fallen perfectly into place. The only thing he still did not understand was that the quiet man standing before him had spent years building trust with the very animals Tyler believed represented fear itself. The gathering around Marcus Reed and Tyler Briggs grew almost naturally, as though every inmate in the recreation yard had suddenly discovered the exact same destination. Some leaned against the chain-link fence while others stopped beside the basketball court, pretending to continue ordinary conversations even though their eyes remained fixed on the two men standing only a few yards apart. Tyler welcomed every new face that joined the circle. An audience always made him feel stronger. Marcus appeared completely unaffected by the growing crowd. He stood with relaxed shoulders, his hands resting comfortably at his sides, breathing with slow, steady rhythm while the afternoon breeze carried another distant bark from the secured K-9 enclosure. Tyler noticed the sound immediately and smiled. "Hear that?" he asked loudly enough for everyone nearby to listen. "They know somebody new is here." A few inmates laughed. Marcus quietly looked toward the enclosure before returning his attention to Tyler. "Dogs notice many things that people miss," he replied. Tyler shook his head with a confident grin. "You keep talking about them like you understand them." Marcus answered simply, "Every living creature communicates. Most people are too busy speaking to listen." The unexpected answer caused several nearby inmates to exchange thoughtful glances. Tyler refused to let the moment slow his momentum. He took another step closer and pointed toward the secured gate leading to the K-9 training area. "Then maybe today you can get a better look." His followers immediately understood the suggestion and casually shifted their positions, creating the impression that Marcus had only one obvious direction left to walk. None of them touched him. None of them needed to. The pressure came entirely from the crowd and Tyler's confidence. Marcus slowly looked around the circle of faces surrounding him. There was fear in some eyes, curiosity in others, and amusement in a few, but he showed no sign of anger. Instead, he quietly nodded once. "If that is where everyone wishes to stand," he said calmly, "then I will walk." His unexpected response caught Tyler slightly off guard. He had expected hesitation. Instead, Marcus began walking at an unhurried pace toward the fenced K-9 training area, with Tyler and the growing crowd naturally following several steps behind. Officer Linda Alvarez noticed the unusual movement almost immediately. From across the yard, she saw dozens of inmates drifting toward the canine section instead of remaining scattered throughout the recreation area. She informed another correctional officer by radio that an unusually large crowd was forming, then started walking toward the security gate herself. Inside the enclosure, the afternoon K-9 training session had just concluded. Several handlers guided their dogs toward shaded resting areas, while one large German shepherd remained quietly seated near the interior fence, calmly watching the movement outside. As Marcus approached the outer security fence, his pace slowed almost imperceptibly. He never reached toward the enclosure. He never called out. He simply observed the dog with quiet respect from a safe distance. The German shepherd lifted its head, studying Marcus with unusual focus before standing calmly on all four paws. One of the handlers noticed the change and glanced toward the fence with mild curiosity. Tyler folded his arms, believing the next few moments would finally expose the quiet newcomer in front of everyone watching. "Go ahead," he said with an exaggerated smile. "You have been looking over here since yesterday. Do not stop now." Marcus looked through the chain-link fence, meeting the dog's attentive gaze for only a brief second before lowering his eyes in a slow, respectful gesture that experienced handlers often use to avoid unnecessary tension. The German shepherd remained completely still. No frantic barking followed. No signs of agitation appeared. Instead, the dog quietly tilted its head as though trying to remember something long forgotten. Officer Alvarez arrived beside the security gate just in time to witness the silent exchange. A strange feeling settled over her as she watched the animal's calm reaction. Around them, the inmates waited for something dramatic to happen, completely unaware that the most remarkable part of the encounter had already begun long before anyone else recognized it. The entire recreation yard seemed to stop breathing. No one spoke as Marcus Reed remained standing a respectful distance from the secured K-9 enclosure, his posture relaxed and his attention focused on the large German shepherd behind the fence. The dog continued watching him with remarkable concentration, its ears forward, its body calm, showing none of the restless energy the inmates had expected. Tyler Briggs folded his arms and looked around at the growing crowd with a confident grin. "See," he called out. "He cannot even get any closer." A few inmates laughed, believing the moment had ended before it truly began. Marcus did not answer. Instead, he slowly lowered one open hand beside his leg, keeping every movement deliberate and unhurried. Officer Linda Alvarez noticed the gesture immediately. It was not random. It was the kind of calm body language experienced handlers used to communicate confidence rather than tension. Her curiosity instantly turned into focused attention. Inside the enclosure, the German shepherd took several slow steps toward the interior fence. One of the K-9 officers instinctively reached for the leash attached to the dog's harness. But the animal remained perfectly composed, never pulling, never barking, simply watching Marcus with growing interest. The quiet became almost overwhelming. Tyler shook his head with an amused smile. "Go ahead," he said loudly. "You have been staring at these dogs since you arrived. Show everybody what is so special." Marcus gently looked toward the handler standing inside the enclosure before speaking for the first time in several minutes. "May I greet him from here?" The respectful question surprised everyone, including the officers. The K-9 handler glanced toward Officer Alvarez, who slowly nodded. "From outside the fence only," she replied. Marcus answered with a polite nod of appreciation. He remained exactly where he was, never approaching the barrier. Then, in a calm voice that barely rose above ordinary conversation, he spoke a single, clear command. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It sounded almost conversational. Yet the effect was immediate. The German shepherd's posture softened. Its tail began moving in slow, relaxed motions, and the animal walked directly toward the fence with quiet confidence before sitting neatly a few feet from Marcus, maintaining steady eye contact as though waiting for the next instruction from someone it deeply trusted. A wave of astonished whispers rolled through the crowd. Several inmates looked at one another in complete disbelief. Tyler's confident smile slowly disappeared. "How did it do that?" someone quietly asked. Marcus remained perfectly still. After several seconds, he offered another short command in the same calm tone. The German Shepherd gently lowered itself into a resting position without hesitation, never breaking eye contact with him. One of the younger correctional officers stared in amazement. "That is one of the advanced obedience commands," he whispered to the handler beside him. "We barely use it anymore." Officer Alvarez felt a chill run through her as every unanswered question from the previous day suddenly connected. Marcus had never behaved like someone fascinated by the dogs. He had behaved like someone who understood them completely. Tyler stepped closer, still trying to recover his confidence. "You got lucky," he insisted, although his voice no longer carried the certainty everyone had heard earlier. Marcus finally turned toward him with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving at Ironwood. "Trust is never luck," he said quietly. "It is earned one patient day at a time." Nobody laughed. Even Tyler's closest followers remained silent. The recreation yard had become so quiet that the distant sound of flags moving in the afternoon breeze could be heard above the prison walls. The German Shepherd continued sitting peacefully near the fence, its attention fixed entirely on Marcus, as though no time had passed between them. Officer Alvarez looked from the dog to Marcus and realized she was no longer witnessing an unusual coincidence. She was watching the unmistakable reunion between a highly trained working dog and someone who had once been far more than an ordinary handler. While every inmate standing in that yard slowly understood that the quiet newcomer had never been the helpless target they imagined. No one inside the recreation yard seemed willing to break the silence. Every eye remained fixed on Marcus Reed and the German Shepherd sitting peacefully behind the secured fence. What had begun as another afternoon of curiosity had quietly become something none of the inmates had expected. Tyler Briggs stood motionless, searching for an explanation that refused to appear. The confidence that had carried him through the entire afternoon slowly faded as he looked from the calm dog to the equally calm man, standing only a few feet away. Officer Linda Alvarez finally stepped closer to the fence, her attention focused entirely on Marcus. "Where did you learn those commands?" she asked. Marcus turned toward her with quiet respect. "A long time ago," he answered. "From some very good teachers." Alvarez studied him for another moment before looking toward the K9 handler inside the enclosure. "Use the secondary recall command," she said. The handler nodded and calmly gave a professional recall instruction that every working dog assigned to Ironwood had been trained to obey. The German Shepherd immediately responded, standing smoothly before returning to the handler's side exactly as instructed. The display of discipline confirmed something important. The dog had not ignored its current handler. It had simply recognized Marcus first. Alvarez slowly exhaled. Every unanswered question from the previous 2 days finally fit together. She quietly reached for the radio clipped to her shoulder and requested that an administrative supervisor retrieve the archived personnel records connected to Marcus Reed's transfer history. Several minutes later, a lieutenant arrived carrying a digital tablet containing the missing documentation that had not accompanied Marcus's abbreviated intake summary. Standing beside the recreation yard, the lieutenant silently reviewed the records before looking up with unmistakable surprise. "This cannot be right," he murmured. Alvarez stepped closer. "What does it say?" The lieutenant turned the screen toward her. Before his incarceration, Marcus Reed served for more than 12 years as a certified law enforcement K9 handler, trainer, and instructor. He specialized in advanced obedience, search operations, and handler certification. He also assisted in training correctional K9 teams. Alvarez looked back at Marcus with renewed respect. That explains why the dog responded the way it did. The senior K9 handler standing inside the enclosure slowly smiled as another detail appeared on the personnel record. "Look at the K9 identification history," he said quietly. Alvarez scrolled farther down the page. A photograph of the same German Shepherd appeared beside an older training record. Beneath it was a simple notation. "Original primary handler, Marcus Reed." Alvarez looked through the fence toward the dog, then back at Marcus. Everything suddenly made perfect sense. The animal had not simply obeyed a familiar command. It had recognized the person who had first earned its trust years earlier. A quiet wave of astonishment moved through the inmates gathered around the enclosure as fragments of the conversation reached them. Tyler stared at Marcus without speaking. For the first time since anyone inside Ironwood could remember, he found himself completely without an answer. Marcus gently rested one hand against the outside of the fence, never crossing the security boundary. The German shepherd calmly stepped forward again, sitting several feet away with quiet attention fixed entirely on him. Marcus smiled softly. "You still remember," he whispered. The dog responded by gently wagging its tail, while remaining perfectly disciplined in position. No dramatic display followed. No loud celebration interrupted the moment. Somehow the quiet reunion carried far more power than any spectacle ever could have. Alvarez closed the personnel file and looked toward the gathering of inmates. "Some lessons cannot be learned by intimidation," she said thoughtfully. "Some have to be earned through years of patience, consistency, and trust." Nobody argued with her. Even the afternoon breeze seemed quieter as Marcus and the German shepherd shared one final peaceful glance across the fence, reminding everyone watching that genuine loyalty has a remarkable way of remembering the people who once chose kindness over fear. Even after the recreation period ended, the story continued moving through Ironwood State Prison faster than any rumor had before. Inmates returning to their housing units spoke in unusually quiet voices, each trying to describe what they had witnessed near the K-9 enclosure. Some focused on the calm commands Marcus Reed had spoken. Others talked about the German shepherd recognizing him without hesitation. Many simply admitted they had never imagined that the quiet newcomer carried years of experience hidden behind a plain prison uniform. Tyler Briggs walked back toward his housing unit surrounded by the same men who had confidently followed him only an hour earlier. Yet this time no one expected him to entertain the crowd with another joke or another boast. Even his closest followers remained silent, sensing that something important had shifted. Tyler replayed every moment in his mind and gradually realized the part that troubled him most. Marcus had never tried to embarrass him. He had never raised his voice, never mocked anyone, and never used the unexpected reunion to make himself appear superior. The respect Marcus received had arrived naturally, without being demanded. That thought stayed with Tyler long after the cell doors closed for the evening. Across the housing unit, Marcus quietly returned the borrowed library book he had carried throughout the day to the small shelf beside his bunk. His older cellmate, Walter Jenkins, smiled as soon as the heavy steel door closed behind them. "Looks like everyone finally knows who you are," Walter said. Marcus gently shook his head. "They know a small part of my past. That is different from knowing who I am." Walter laughed softly. "You could have told them from the beginning." Marcus sat beside the narrow window and looked toward the fading evening light beyond the security fence. People believe words only when they are ready. Sometimes actions arrive first. Walter nodded thoughtfully, understanding far more than Marcus had actually said. The following morning, before the first rays of sunlight reached the prison yard, Marcus once again walked quietly toward the recreation area during the early movement period. The air felt cool and peaceful, carrying only the distant sounds of birds beyond the prison walls. As he approached the familiar path beside the secured K-9 enclosure, he noticed Officer Linda Alvarez already standing near the gate. She greeted him with a respectful smile that had not been there the day before. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she said. Marcus returned the greeting with a polite nod. "Good morning, officer." Alvarez hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "The K-9 unit starts training in a few minutes. If you would like, you may watch from the designated observation area during recreation. I think some of our younger handlers could learn something simply by seeing how calmly the dogs respond to you." Marcus smiled warmly but gently shook his head. "The dogs already have excellent handlers. My place is simply to wish them well." Alvarez understood immediately. Marcus had no interest in attention. He had only shown kindness to an old partner who happened to remember him. As the first German shepherd entered the training yard, the familiar dog from the previous afternoon briefly turned toward Marcus and calmly wagged its tail before returning its full attention to the handler giving instructions. Marcus quietly smiled. "That is exactly how it should be," he whispered. Later that morning, Tyler approached Marcus alone near the walking track. There was no audience waiting, no followers standing behind him, and no challenge in his voice. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I spent a lot of time trying to make people respect me." Marcus looked at him patiently. Tyler continued. "Yesterday I realized respect and fear are not the same thing." Marcus nodded gently. "One disappears when people stop being afraid. The other remains even after you leave the room." Tyler lowered his eyes before offering a sincere nod of appreciation. Neither man said another word. As the morning sun rose above Ironwood State Prison, inmates continued their ordinary routines, correctional officers resumed their daily responsibilities, and the K-9 team carried on with another training session. Yet something inside the prison had quietly changed forever. Whenever a new inmate later arrived believing that strength belonged only to the loudest voice, someone would simply point toward the distant K-9 enclosure and say, "Watch carefully. The strongest bond is built with patience, and the strongest person is often the one who never feels the need to prove it."